One of the frustrations that often shows up in change programs is the sense that there isn't really any resistance, but the change still isn't moving forward. What you might be missing are some typical early signs of resistance which can be disguised as something else. You need to be able to recognise them or they can derail your change efforts. In this episode, I'll share some early signs based on my experience. Welcome to the Applied Change Management Podcast. I'm Rose, and after more than a decade working in change management, I started this podcast to share practical lessons from the programs I've worked on. So this is the situation. The project team is communicating valuable information regularly. Updates have been shared, meetings have happened, and people attend the briefings and the trainings. On the surface, everything looks fairly positive. But when you look at what's actually happening day to day, adoption is slower than expected and the new way of working doesn't quite take hold. That's often the point where resistance starts to become visible, but it might not look the way people expect it to. In organisations, resistance is rarely loud or dramatic. You almost never see someone stand up in a meeting and declare, "I refuse to change," or that they won't adopt the new way of working. Much more often, it shows up through small behaviours that repeat across teams and projects. At first, those behaviours can look like normal organisational activities, which is why they're easy to overlook. Over time, though, certain patterns start to appear and give the game away. The thing is, those early resistant patterns that seem so innocent and people just being people tend to mount up. And then, before you know it, you've got lots of very overt resistance showing up on multiple fronts, and your entire change effort is in danger of missing its return on investment, or it might never land at all. One of the most common patterns is repeated questioning of the change itself. At the start of a project, questions are completely expected. People want to understand why the change is happening, how the decision was made, if the solution's been tested, and what impact it might have on their work. Those are healthy conversations. But sometimes the same questions continue long after the answers already exist and have been shared with the same people multiple times. The topic comes up again in different meetings. Someone raises the same concerns in a slightly different way. The conversation circles back to the same points. What started as curiosity can gradually become something that slows the momentum of change. The discussion never quite moves forward, and if the discussion doesn't move forward, it's stuck, which means there is resistance to the change and you need to take some action to support your impacted group. Another behaviour that shows up quite often is what might be described as polite agreement. People attend the project briefings, they go through the training, they say they understand the new process and it makes sense. From the project team's perspective, everything looks supportive. But when you look more closely at what's actually happening in the work itself, the previous process is still being followed. The new way of working exists in theory, but the old one remains in practice. No one has openly rejected the change, but adoption hasn't happened either. It's just a quiet behaviour that means people simply aren't changing the way they work. What you're hearing in meetings is lip service. They've got no intention of changing how they work at all. So again, once you've spotted this, you need to take some action to support them or your change efforts will have amounted to nothing. Another sneaky version of resistance is through, quote, operational pressure, end quote. In lots of organisations, teams are already dealing with full workload. Customer demands, deadlines and operational issues all compete for attention. When the change comes along, it gets acknowledged, but it isn't always prioritised. The work carries on like it always has, and the change is something that'll be addressed once things calm down. But the challenge is, though, that things rarely calm down in organisations. There's always another urgent issue to deal with. So the change keeps being pushed slightly further away every time it comes up, just politely kicked down the road, and gradually it loses momentum. Busyness is a very common behaviour in early resistance. It's not as quiet as the polite agreement, but it'll cause you issues just the same. And remember, it's the small early signs of resistance that can give you a hint about how you can reduce it down the line. If the change isn't prioritised in the early stages, it won't be prioritised later either. So make sure you support your impacted groups by identifying the resistance. Workarounds can show up as hidden resistance as well, especially when systems or processes change. The new system might technically be introduced and people might log into it and complete the steps needed. But alongside the new system, other tools begin to appear. Spreadsheets start circulating, manual tracking lists appear, informal steps get added to the process so people can continue working in the way that feels more comfortable for them. From the outside, the change looks implemented, but underneath, the previous way of working is still operating in parallel. And that means for you, your change efforts are being resisted, which matters even if it's done covertly, because your adoption metrics won't show the return of investment you and your project need. The kinds of behaviours I've mentioned are quite common in organisations, and they don't always mean people are deliberately resisting the change. Sometimes they're just reflecting uncertainty or the practical pressures people are working under. When the same patterns start to repeat across teams, they can be a signal that the change hasn't been fully accepted yet. Understanding what resistance actually looks like, including sneaky resistance dressed up as normal business in organisations, helps explain those moments when adoption moves slower than expected. Those behaviours are usually visible long before anyone talks about resistance directly. Once you've identified that you have resistance to the change, you'll want to know the root cause of it and how to tackle it. In episode 4 of the podcast, I talk more about all of that and go into the types of resistance and how I've used applied change management to reduce it. What I'd like you to take away from this episode is that resistance in organisation is rarely dramatic. Much more often, it appears through small signals like repeated questioning, polite agreement without changing, operational pressure excuses, or workarounds. Recognising those signals is often the first step in understanding if the change is not really landing, and if it's not, action is needed by you to support your impacted group, reduce the resistance, and increase adoption. Thanks for watching or listening to the Applied Change Management podcast. If you found this week's episode helpful, please follow, like, comment, or share it within your network, and come back next week for more applied change management topics. And I'll see you there.